Okay, guys. So you read Emerson's piece on nature. Now I had you read his piece on self-reliance. Remember that the individual is once again very, very important within transcendentalism, just like it was in Romanticism, maybe even more so in transcendentalism. Um, self-reliance, if you think about it, is an interesting piece because the text that you guys have read, I've tried to show you how they kind of build on each other. We have a train of thought that's been started from Columbus up to now. So if you were to connect this piece to another one that you've read, I'm going to let you think for a second, which one might it be? And my thinking is that you could connect this directly to Ben Franklin's On the Wealth of Man. I think that's what it's called. But I'm sorry, The Way of Wealth. Forgive me. Anyways, you could connect this piece directly to that because that piece was talking about how you need to be self-reliant and how you need to make your own way in the world and not don't rely on other people, don't borrow money, don't lend money, etc., etc., etc. So we have those thoughts directly in here. So, and I even I'll tell you in a second, but we even have a recall to the Revolution of '75 in Thoreau. So it's really amazing how, as he calls it, it's amazing how these pieces connect. So keep these things in mind as you read literature. It's really fascinating to kind of trace the lineage of literature. So Self-Reliance is a very famous piece by Emerson. And if you can imagine him sort of standing at this big lecture hall somewhere, giving this fiery speech about how we need to be independent, how we need to, not be reliant on other people and all these other things. You can imagine this just like chorus of applause after every point that he makes, and it's very similar to the way politics works nowadays. I think that's probably the closest thing we have. So he says at the beginning, he says that genius is to believe in your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true of all men. That is genius. And he doesn't mean like that's genius. He means that is what genius is. And remember, this is a group of intellectuals. So that is the highest or the highest sentiment that he can make here, the highest point that he can make. He says, yet man, people, individuals, dismiss without notice his thought because it is his. So he's saying that it's a universal experience that when we have a thought, we tend to dismiss it because, oh, it's just me. It's not like that was Stephen Hawking or something that said it was just me. He's saying we shouldn't do that as enlightened individuals. We need to value our own thoughts. So if you go to the next page, go down to about the middle. There's a beautiful phrase, which I feel like everyone needs to have on a plaque somewhere. He says, trust thyself, every heart vibrates to that iron string. So he's saying the value of the individual is one of the highest values you can have. And he's talking about using your own mind and your own creative intuition. Remember, intuition is very, very important for transcendentalists, sort of trusting your gut, if you will. Using your intuition to value your own contributions to the world, to society. And you can see how Emerson's thoughts have lasted for 200 years. Almost 200 years. So he says, accept the place the divine providence. So again, we have this mention of sort of a divine presence being influencing and connecting with man. Accept the place the divine providence has found for you. Accept the society of your contemporaries, the connection of events. Great men have always done so and confided themselves childlike to the genius of their age, betraying their perception that the eternal was stirring at their heart, working at their hands, predominating in all their being. So great men, everyone has discounted themselves at some point as not being worthy of being taken seriously. But he's saying providence, God, a divine presence of some kind, connects with the individual and has made you, the work of your mind, your hands, and your heart perfect. So worthy of contribution to the world. Um, so if you move down a little bit, he focuses on talking about emotion over reason. So again, we have that discussion of consciousness getting in the way of genius, in other words. So remember, we've already gone through the Enlightenment, we've gone through the age of reason and science, and now we have a direct reaction against it. Romanticism went really far against it. Now we're kind of coming back a little bit, but we're discounting logic not as something that is, forgive me, I'm trying to put my words in order, not as something that is not useful, but something that does get in the way of genius. So he says that, think about that divided and rebel mind, that distrust of sentiment, so emotion, because our arithmetic, our logic, has computed the strength and means opposed to our purpose. So he's saying, again, we let our conscious mind get in the way of our creative abilities and our God-given gifts, because we rely too much on our head and not enough on what's in our heart. So on the next page he says, you need to be, this is where I was talking about in the previous video, he says you need to be sure of yourself essentially like a child is. And he gives a story about a schoolboy and how he never doubts that he's going to be the best in the class, or he's going to be fed that night, or anything like that. He never doubts that everything's going to be okay. And he says adults don't do this, and we need to. He says the schoolboy never cumbers himself about consequences or interests. He gives independent and genuine verdicts. So it's something wholly original to the kid. So the kid doesn't worry about younger kids don't try to worry about sounding like everybody else or saying the right thing or anything like that. They just say what they want to say, and it's an original idea. It says you must court him, the boy. He does not court you. So essentially, you make other people come to you rather than always trying to please everybody else. He says, but the man is, as it were, clapped into jail by his consciousness. As soon as he has once acted or spoken, as with a clat, he is a committed person. So he's saying committed in the sense that you are trapped, as in jail. So we need emotion to kind of free ourselves from this prison that our consciousness puts us into. And he says, whoso would be a man must be a non-conformist. So don't try to fit in with everybody else. Down on the bottom of page 271, he says, a man must carry himself in the presence of all opposition if everything were titular and ephemeral, but I am ashamed to think how easily we capitulate to badges and names, to large societies and dead institutions. That is a very powerful statement. So he's saying, I am ashamed to think of the fact that we work our whole lives just to gain a title or some notoriety or to fit into some prescribed structure, so we can have some place of note on that structure. So I'm going to use, for example, say a lawyer. He's saying it's sad that we go to school, we study, we try and get into a good law school, we try and get into a good firm, and then we work our way up from admin or assistant all the way up to hopefully someday partner, just so we can say I'm a partner at a law firm, and all blah 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 blah. So that's just an example of the type of thing that he's talking about. And it's true. Like I said, it's true 200 years later, and that's what's amazing about Emerson's works. On the next page, 272, the last page, he does have a really interesting section here about philanthropy. And if you ever take a class that starts just after this one does, in terms of time periods, so like 1870s, 80s up, there is a humongous discussion of philanthropy in American society and what its function is, or what you should be doing, what you shouldn't be doing in terms of philanthropy. Think of this is the Gilded Age. We're moving towards the Gilded Age, when we had the Big Four, you had Vanderbilt and J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller. So keep that in mind if you think about where they're heading. So he basically says in this section on philanthropy that you shouldn't really worry about it. That every man is responsible for himself and should make his own way in the world. And if you enable him, that you are not helping him. And the individual must be empowered in himself. He's not saying that we shouldn't, help people who need it, help the poor, help, children who need help or things like that. He's just saying the enlightened man makes his own way in the world. And he says, my life should be unique. It should be an alms, a battle, a conquest, a medicine, which is a really powerful, and I just want to draw your attention to a very cool statement. It says, few and mean as my average, as mean as my gifts may be, I actually am and do not need for my own assurance or the assurance of my fellows any secondary testimony. So I don't need somebody else to, even though I know that my gifts may not be the best gifts in the world, they're mine. And that's enough. I don't need somebody else to congratulate me or put me on a pedestal or tell me how wonderful I am. My gifts are enough. And so lastly he says, what I must do is all that concerns me, not what the people think. So again, we have this refocus on solitariness and the individual. And he says, but the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude. So that is Emerson, and you can see why he is such an amazing writer, such an amazing speaker. So hopefully it gives you an idea of how these texts connect to Transcendentalism and a little bit more of what Transcendentalism is all about. As you move to Thoreau, I want you to look at how, even though they are connected writers, Thoreau was a much more controversial man. Not always well liked. His ideas were not always well received. So I want you to see what it is about his text that maybe kind of put people off a little bit, but also how his ideas follow Emerson's.